Bright Lights brings with it a brand new version of many players' favorite hero, Dash. Database Dash has all the information, well, at least the info from the top of her deck, which, let's remember, can change over the course of the turn. Knowledge is always power, but if it's an item, she can also play it, once on your turn and once on an opponent's turn. So on the surface, a 5-card hand every turn, right? And while that's true, from a certain point of view, she admittedly gives up quite a bit as compared to her OG version. So today I want to dive into that conversation. Her ability's super strong, but comes at a trade-off. How does it translate into existing strategies, and how do new potential strategies from Bright Lights factor in? A huge shout out to our channel members for supporting what we do here. If you want to get involved with the channel and the Dice Commando community, please consider joining as a channel member. Remember, these videos are only possible with your support. You can show that support with a like, a subscribe, and by leaving us a comment and sharing your feedback. Community first, and go Commando. Hey there, Flesh and Blood folks. Welcome back to Dice Commando and Go Again. A fabulous cast. Thanks for tuning in here midweek with spoiler season, or I should say the bulk of spoiler season right around the corner. Stuff's going to start dropping Friday all through the weekend, coming at us hard and fast. You all know how it goes. It's going to be very exciting. Now, I'm also very aware that just a few days ago, we saw Mr. Max Velocity himself get spoiled, rounding out the 3 heroes we're going to see in this set. But today I want to focus entirely on new Dash, Database Dash, and I want to talk about her ability. I think it's very interesting in context of not only the current strategies we have, but at least the forecasting of what we've seen that will be coming in Bright Lights, specifically with Evos and stuff like that, and kind of how it all fits in. And then as part of this conversation, as promised in the thumbnail, I really want to talk about kind of the value side of this. But the only thing we can really do is compare that directly to Dash. So first off, let's start off with Dash.io. So when we saw the very first announcement for Bright Lights, we saw Tech Levasin, adult and young, I believe. But we also saw right alongside it Dash.io. Now, Dash.io is implied, I think, here to be the adult version of Dash Database, but might not be, right? So I think that's very interesting that, because there's no reason they couldn't call Dash Database the young version of Dash Database. There's no reason they couldn't call her database as an adult hero. They chose not to. That might be just a lore thing. Again, we've seen something very similar to that in the case of Prism. So there's no reason they couldn't. I mean, that's probably what's happening here, right? It's probably Young's database, old. So it's more than likely the same hero. But I just want to throw out the disclaimer that we are going to be today assuming that this hero scales to both Blitz and CC. That is possible. It's not the case. Probably is the case, and we're going to be making that assumption. All right. So next, let's talk about this ability. Right. This is very, very, very strong. Right. So you can always look at the top of your deck. Don't be that guy that's like using it to stall or something like that. Right. But always look at the top of your deck. Now, let's keep in mind the top of your deck can change, especially if you're doing a boost strategy. And that's where things start getting very interesting. One of the things that starts getting very interesting on is the boost strategy, because you get to look at the top of your deck, right? Traditionally, especially if we're talking Blitz here, right? Like a Teklo Pounder, hash pound boost is what I called it, right? If you're starting with Teklo Pounder, right, you're just going all mech because you don't want to miss. You can't afford to miss. In CC, sometimes, often, actually, people will play a little bit different on that. And that's fine, but again, you're in a situation here where you now know the top of your deck. Now, you can't necessarily change, like let's say it's a non-mech card or that's not an item, right, in this case. You might not necessarily be able to play that, but at least you know that it's not a good time to boost. You do some sort of setup turn, arsenaling, whatever you need to do. And there is value in that. So that's a very interesting part of this. Now, the question is the 2 health penalty you take on this hero, again, if you're playing it exactly the same way as OG Dash in terms of boosting, you're down the item, you're down 2 health, there's no reason to do it that, right? So you're obviously looking at a slightly different strategy here, but there's value out of that, right? Because like, let's say you want to play Sink Belows or Fate for Scenes or something like that, well, you get value out of that. Right? And if you play more than 2 of them, in theory at least, you're getting that value versus blocking 3. But then you consider that straight boost doesn't want to dash boost anyway, so then you're right. You follow, right? You get the value out of it in theory, or you can put yourself in a situation where you get the value out of it, but it's not necessarily the best thing overall as it is. Okay. All right, now let's talk about the next part here, which is obviously using her ability to play items, right? I mean, that's what the ability does. So what's the value in that really when we look at it? So it's going to cost you 1 extra to play it as an instant. So on the surface, the best time to use it is when you have floating resources, right? Now, sure, if you're playing like, let's say a 2-cost item, pitching a blue to it, not that big of a deal. It's still 1 card. I'm not saying that's ideal, right? But where I'm thinking you get the best value out of this is like something on, again, maybe a boost turn. Okay, so you play like a combustible courier, you're pitching a blue to it. You might have 1 resource floating. In many cases, you use that to load pistol or something like that. Well, in this case, you could, in theory, play like a hyperdriver or something like that, right? You see what I'm saying, right? You use that resource that, you maybe could have gotten something out of, but you're going to be able to essentially play the hyperdriver to invest in the future, or any such analogy to that, right, in terms of other useful items. Now, playing it on your opponent's turn is an interesting concept because you really need to be, again, maybe in this case, you're playing like an Oasis or something like that, to where you're getting value out of, you've already pitched the card, you have effective floating resources. Sure, it's a good time to perhaps do that because you're going to lose it anyway. So I could see that. But where I really am curious to see how this goes, and to be clear, we don't have the answer on this yet, but where I'm really curious to see this go is how this fits in with Evos, right? So what we've seen on our Evos is that of the one we've seen, right? I think we've only seen the one today, but it has a on-play ability. Okay, so in the case of this one, let me find it here. In the case of this one, the Evil Soul Memory, when you do it, you get +1 intelligence for turns. Right? So this one specifically is not going to help you on your opponent's turn. But in theory, there could be other ones that do, right? Maybe block 2 damage or something like that, right? Could very much fit into, I could absolutely see stuff like that would absolutely fit into this. Because remember, you can replace these as they go. Right? You can overwrite them or replace them or upgrade into them, whatever we want to, right? Evo into them, whatever we want to call that. So I could absolutely see that being a thing. And in that case, if you have defense beneficial type triggers or something like that, you could absolutely see wanting to play it on your opponent's turn, right? And you could, again, like do an Oasis and then play a 1-drop and paying the 2 for it or something like that. You all follow. So that's going to be something I'm very much looking at as we move into spoiler season in terms of if she's able to use them that way. But again, remember, kind of bringing us back to the previous point, it has to be on the top of your deck. So that's not going to necessarily, it's going to be on the top of your deck and on your opponent's turn, you're not going to be able to manipulate that as easy, right? So it's not going to necessarily be a core battle plan or a core feature for you, because you're not going to be able to control that as well as you will in the case where you're boosting, where you're like, oh, I don't like that card, 0 to 60 boost. Oh, I like that one. That's a very different conversation in terms of usefulness for her. So that's really where I think she ends up going, is probably some sort of combination with like a mid-range type boost strategy where you're trying to get stronger as you go. That's at least what tracks to me. Because again, right, let's take something as simple as like Teklo Core, right? Teklo Core is amazing, produces a resource for you that you can use to get an extra card out of your hand on your boost turns, but it's going to cost you 1 to play it from the top of your deck, right? So, back to my point about having the floating resources available, and I think most of the time you're going to have those available on your turn as you're playing a high-speed impact or a combustible courier or anything, right? Anything that you're playing for. Then you can do that, drop that down, get something out of it next time, and then maybe you do have an extra floating resource to do it again next time. I'm talking off your Teklo Core in this case. So you can see how it's spiraling. So that's really where, at least in context of what we know today, that she seems to be going. Right, next, I do want to put into context, because we're, in theory, having the value discussion here, right? I want to talk about the value loss of Evos, and specifically what I mean by that, and stick with me here, we're going to go Mordor, Shire, and right back, right? When you are playing equipment, one of the things equipment can do for you, blocking equipment, is save your butt from on hits, right? If you're right, you see it sometimes with new players, they throw equipment way too early, right? They don't use it in the right spot, right? But as you develop, you learn that you save your blocking equipment for a time when you really need to stop an on hit. Maybe you're getting dominated, you can only throw one card, you need two to make up the gap, or you've got a really good hand, you can't afford to take an on hit, you throw your armor at it, whatever, right? That's where armor comes in. Now with Evos, if you pop your head, right, let's say you block and it's battle worn, or blade break, excuse me, battle worn would be great. Let's say you block and it's blade break, or again, in the case here, it's temper, right? If for whatever reason you're forced to block with this and then they shred it or something like this, you lose your head slot. And then all of a sudden, anything in your deck that you had been running in a head slot with the plan of evoing it, of upgrading it, you're in trouble, right? Now, sure, maybe there are ways to re-equip a base head or something like that. It doesn't seem to imply that way. It seems to imply that way that you need the base stuff equipped going in. So, right, that's a concern. So where I'm going, so right now back to the Shire part of this, okay, if you are not able to use your equipment to fully block, right? And again, that's why in this case, that's probably why in this case it's temper 3 is so that you can still get 2 blocks out of it, 2 very good blocks out of it, a 3 and a 2. But if you get to the 1, you lose it, you lose your head, now you're in trouble, right? So you do lose the inherent value of not being able to block with your equipment, unless, of course, they, as the case here, power creep. I mean, it's not power creep in that case. They useful creep, whatever you want to say, but they put a higher block value on it with their temper or their battle warns or whatever. Like battle warn would be fine, right? But you're more worried about blade break, but blade break doesn't matter. So, right. So temper is basically what we're entirely talking about. But hopefully you see what I'm driving at here is primarily the point that you lose the ability to just throw the fridge in some cases, right? And if it's early and you only have, let's say, your base equipment out or whatever it may be, you may not have the luxury. You're going to have to take the on hit because you're not going to be able to just completely screw your game plan to avoid a crippling crush or something to that effect. Okay. So again, I want to make sure that we're keeping that in our head as we go through, that if we are going some sort of Evo strategy, trying to take advantage of that, that there's an inherent value. It's not necessarily a value loss, I suppose isn't the right way to say that, but there's definitely a restriction, a play restriction on that certainly limits the way we can play. And there's a value that can be assigned to flexibility and being able to change on the way. All right. So let's go ahead and bring up then my dash value comparison. All right. So what we're doing is I have the two of them side by side, and we're just going to go through and talk about them value-wise. Now we can do this again. Like I mentioned at the beginning, we're going to go ahead and assume that database and IO scale to each other, right? They're the same version, but just young and adult. So that's the assumption here. Okay, so we have -2, -4 health, right? 18 and 36. Okay, that's like Icelander range. Okay, so we have to put into context that she's going to be able to supply the same type of value as Icelander can. Not necessarily saying is strong, but you understand what I'm saying, right? So she has the extra card access item, which many folks have been attributing to, oh my goodness, I'm playing with a 5-card hand. And I want to say, I don't think that's true, right? From a certain point of view, yes, that is true. If you have a bunch of items, it's absolutely true, but not entirely, right? So again, you can use that ability for free if you have a floating resource. And one thing that's really cool about this type of strategy, right? What this ability is, if you think about, let's apply it to like, I think they call it the tree frog dash or right ninja turtle dash. Well, it wasn't ninja, but turtle dash or something like that, right? Where the point is you run a bunch of D-reacts that you don't necessarily want. You cycle your deck. You get a bunch of the items out as you cycle your deck. And then by the time you've played all the defensive stuff and thinned your deck out, now it's mostly mech, and then you're free to boost and go, right? I mean, that's a very solid early strategy that Matt Rogers kind of employed very early on. It's carried, it's a very solid strategy, right? So in this case, Dash Database is phenomenal for that because she essentially helps you accelerate that first cycle, right? Because if you see one sitting there, you can then play it from there versus having to play it in your hand. sure, you're pitching for it, but you'd be pitching for it anyway, so it effectively gives you one more defense card, right? So it's not one more card you can play, but it is one more card in your hand because you're playing from top of deck, right? So in that case, that's a very solid argument to having the 5-card hand, the exception being you don't always have it on the top of your deck, but you're not always drawing an item either. But again, it's still one more. Okay, so in that case, it's a very solid strategy. And then if you have to think about the boosting strategy, which we have on the bottom there, you have the knowledge, which can help, which of course there's value in that. And then to my point earlier about playing D-Reacts, like let's say we just do a very basic thing, which is we play a boost heavy strategy, but we say, hey, I want to get a little extra defense. You could play Sink Belows and Fate for Scenes, and you would only, in Blitz, you would only have to play 2 of them. In CC, you'd have to play 4, and play using them to defend, right? But what I'm saying is use them instead of defending with a normal card. Well, that's how you get your value back. You'd have to do that 2 times in Blitz, 4 times in CC to get your health value back, assuming you're defending. But then again, there's a slight value loss to that in the fact that that's not a boost card, and it's not a boostable card. So, because again, you can't play it from the top of your deck. So if you see one on there, you're just like, well, I guess this is a defense turn arsenal or something like that. Sure, that's good that you know that you didn't get screwed, but it's still not optimal, and you can't fix the problem, right? On the flip side, we go back to OG Dash, right? She starts with 2 value in play, plus it's 1 card value, because it's effectively, if you really think about it realistically, you're drawing your first turn, you draw an extra card that is an item. Right? I mean, that's obviously not what happens, but effectively it's the same thing. So you really have to think of it as 2 value plus 1 card, right? So for the first turn, right, let's say database dash, the first time she does that from top of deck, it's really net neutral to dash. Actually, it's still not net, it's net neutral in cards. You still have to pay for it, whereas you didn't have to pay for it in dash. So you're giving up 2 or 4 health. You're giving up max of 2 resources if you choose accordingly. And then your first time is actually value net neutral, right? So you have to do this a couple of times in order to make up that value. The advantage, though, is, again, if you're going the advantage on Dash Database, I'm saying, is if you're going on the turtle strategy, right? Normally, and with Dash, it would take you roughly 15 turns, and generally a little more because you play a thicker deck in that case, right? But it's going to take you at least 15 turns to turn your deck over, to get all of your items out, or you know what I'm saying, to have seen all of your items, to get your deck turned over. It's going to take you roughly 15 turns. Well, Dash Database does accelerate that to some degree, right? Now, the extent to which she's going to accelerate it is going to depend on the number of items you're playing, the likelihood of those being on top deck so you can play them, and so on. But again, that turtle strategy where you're planning on cycling and then going, Dash Database does seem better positioned to do something like that, with the exception of losing that initial play. So that's really the question overall, is the initial item worth the 2 or 4 health? In Blitz, probably not. In CC, I think it might be. So I think that's going to be very interesting to track going forward on where that value breakpoint sits. The last point I want to talk about on Dash here is she the one who makes Mechanoid playable, right? And specifically, I'm talking about getting hyperdrivers on the table. I mean, that's basically the play here, right? That's the hardest, in my opinion, that's the hardest part of the Mechanoid, is A, making sure you don't screw up and trash any of your equipment on the way, but also making sure you have enough of your hyperdrivers on the table to make it happen. It does seem that she's a pretty solid strategy for making the Mechanoid happen. You get, what is it, be 48 minus 1 because you have to spend your fist to do it. So you'd be 47 damage you could potentially present over the course of several turns. If you're able to like high octane or something into it, you could potentially get multiple, right? Set up like some crazy turn, get your Mechanoid out, and then high octane for like a triple boost. Again, it's pie in the sky land, but over 2 to 3 turns, you can present quite a bit of damage for basically no cost, other than the fact that you just threw your fridge away and you threw all your hyperdrivers away, plus you had to build into it. So there's certainly a cost in there. But I'm going to be very much paying attention to the Mechanoid strategy and seeing what we can do with that with her, because it does seem like she'll be better positioned to do that than OG Dash. So anyway, those are kind of my thoughts overall on this new hero on database database. It's hard to say, but anyway, very exciting. Opens up some really interesting play lines, and I'm very fascinated to pay attention to, again, the spoilers this weekend and how it fits in. I'm hoping that as we start to see more Evos this weekend, which is an almost certainty, right? We're absolutely going to see more Evos this weekend. I'm hoping that we do get to see some like on-play ones that might be defensive, because I think that would be very interesting with her with the instant ability. But we will have to see. So anyway, folks, thanks for tuning in for kind of just a casual strategy chat, just kind of shooting off the hip and really thinking, is she good? Is she not? I certainly don't think she's broken, right? I've heard people is like, this is a broken ability. Again, I could be wrong. We will see over time, but I think it's a good ability. I think it's an interesting ability. I don't think it's broken, but we'll see. So let me know in the comments. Do you agree? Disagree? Nothing else, folks. Thanks for hanging out. Go Commando.